Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today I'm joined by Sloba, who has a YouTube channel called Code with Sloba and covers a lot of web development related topics and quite a bit of React.js content as well, which is kind of going to be our topic of discussion today. But before we kind of get to that, Sloba, could you give me kind of a brief background on yourself, kind of as it relates to coding and software engineering and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. First, thank you so much for inviting me to your show. So yeah, generally I've been a front-end developer for almost a decade now. I had some like back-end development experience before that, but just like on personal projects. And after that, pretty much I was freelancing throughout the entire career, and but I had a chance to head project in some of the big companies like Microsoft, for example. So it was very, very interesting to be there. And for the last year and a half, I've been working with A-Team, which is like a freelancing platform similar to TopTal, but this is just like top tier level platform. I've been working for them, and also I've been a community leader over there for a front end, and I've been in the selection team as well. And 3 years ago, most of the people when code hit started creating some content because you had so much time, right? So I started creating this content, as you said. I have a channel called with Sloba, and also on daily basis, I share valuable tips for people who are getting into the industry on LinkedIn, Instagram. I have over 200,000 followers over there. So if somebody's interested, I highly suggest you go and check it out. And that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Awesome. And I will definitely attest to, I tend to not be on other platforms apart from YouTube and podcasts and stuff. So I haven't seen Instagram and LinkedIn, but I know for your YouTube content, it's very well done, very high quality, as people can probably notice with your mic setup and your background, very good quality content as well.
Like yours. I can just, say the same thing for you as well. So yeah, just keep it up.
Appreciate it. Well, that kind of leads us right into one of your more recent YouTube videos was kind of regarding React.js, and it was regarding kind of handling HTTP requests. And you kind of discussed how you like to manage HTTP requests. So could you maybe give an overview of how you best like to do that within your kind of React apps?
Yeah, actually that changes from time to time, and especially from project to project. But recently I started doing more like Redux toolkit setup, where I like to set up my React application in a Redux toolkit. So I just create a slice, and then what I like to do is just to call the functions from Redux sagas, and then use a separate file where I store all the HTTP requests. Obviously, the endpoints are being probably in a separate file, and the URL itself for the environment is in the separate file as well. So that's pretty much what I like to do. It's a very simple setup, and that's what I like to do to take things very simple and don't complex it too much if you don't have to, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And is there a particular reason that you like using kind of sagas and Redux toolkit compared to maybe just using the built-in fetch request and stuff like that within React?
Well, actually, I do like to use the fetch for the actual method which executes the call itself. But I think that this setup with Redux Toolkit and Watcher Sagas is especially useful when your application starts growing, because at the beginning you can use all sorts of stuff, and it doesn't matter that much. But once you start piling up the pages, routes, and components, then it starts to get really messy. And I think that this kind of a structure at least showed in my case that it's very nice setup for scaling. That's the reason.
Gotcha. So by using that kind of external library, it makes things a little bit more scalable, kind of maybe helps you separate concerns a little bit better, makes it a little bit more extensible in the future. So that totally makes sense. And one thing that you also kind of just mentioned, and you also mentioned in your video, is that you like to kind of handle these HTTP requests in separate files and everything, instead of just doing it right in within a component and stuff like that. Yeah. Could you maybe speak to kind of why you like to do that?
Yeah, because I think that sometimes, especially with HTTP requests and this asynchronous code, they can contain a lot of logic, and especially if you try to handle them in a proper way. So having that in the same component where you have the other logic which alters the data, maybe do some filtering, mapping, and all of those sort of things, it can become very complex and distracting. So what I like to do, like you said, separating concerns and just keep this asynchronous code and request in a separate file. And I think it makes it much more cleaner and easier later to understand what is happening. But that's just me. To be honest, for me, like most of these things is just like my own personal preference. It doesn't have to be like the one and done like way how it needs to be done. But for me, this is like something it's most straightforward and the easiest to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say in almost all projects I work on, we do have like a server file or something in which we handle kind of a lot of our requests and stuff. And I would say just having that separation of logic is super helpful, especially when it comes down the road. Like if you come back to a component and you have 30 lines of code in that component that are just for handling requests and stuff, it makes things a lot more complex. So I think that's super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
And I would say in general, kind of abstracting your logic out to separate files. So like if you have a component in which it's very logic heavy, if you could maybe create a custom hook or something like that to kind of separate into a separate file, I think that kind of follows a similar line in which separating those concerns there can definitely help out.
Yeah, I agree totally with you. So basically, whenever you see that like components getting too large, so there's a chance to separate concerns. So, and for me, I don't know, I mean, maybe somebody likes to work in a component that has like 300, thousands of code lines. So I don't know, for me, it's just like the smaller component, the better. Obviously, I'm also not big a fan of like having the micro components, like having every single UI element as a component, but having something like in the middle, something that you can see actually in your code editor, like you don't have to scroll a lot. That's for me like good eyeball test if the component is good or not.
Absolutely. And I would say in my experience, the most tricky parts of like professional applications I work on, they never occur in components that are like under 50 lines of code. It's always in components that are like 400, 500, 600 lines of code. And it's just like, this is a mess. This component is a headache. And it's just like, it almost gives me a shot of anxiety every time I enter that component. It's just not a great time.
Because you just lose yourself in the component. You know what's happening. So you're right. Yeah. There you go.
Absolutely. And kind of bringing things back to HTTP requests, you mentioned kind of using Redux Toolkit and Sagas for that. Are there other libraries that you like using as well, or that you would recommend for HTTP requests? I know you've maybe mentioned Axios before.
Yes, exactly. So Axios is a good one. To be honest, I like to start off with a fetch, and if there's like a need for Axios, then to include it. Because like I said, first I always like to implement something the simplest possible way, and if there is a need for something, let's increase the complexity. With Axios, you get some additional stuff like intercepting the HTTP requests, canceling them, setting the timeout, stuff like that. So some additional stuff that maybe you need in your project, but if you just need like regular fetching, like the data, something to input in your endpoints, then regular fetch can do the job. So yeah, pretty much that's only the library which I use at the moment is Axios. If there's more advanced stuff needed, And I think when working with Angular, obviously RxJS is something that because it's very heavy on the Angular side as well. So that's what I like to use the most over there. Yeah.
Gotcha. And I know that kind of one thing that you mentioned there was that Axios kind of allows you to maybe cancel these requests and stuff. And one thing you touched on in your video is that one potential mistake that people make is maybe not cleaning up their requests when a component unmounts. So could you maybe speak to the importance of making sure that you clean up your requests?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that everyone has experienced stuff like that. So you know that app is not optimized. If you're like using this application for like 10 minutes and you have like switched like 5 or 6 pages, and you just notice that like application it starts to get slower and slower and slower, and you just refresh your page and it's good back, good again. So this is a great indicator that some of your components or pages is leaking in memory. So that's why it's very very important to just clean up. Maybe you're working maybe it doesn't have to be HTTP request. Maybe you're just dependent on some code from the other parts of the application. Maybe you have just subscription, right? And it's waiting for that stream to send the data. So that's why it's always, and sometimes I make this mistake. But obviously everybody makes this mistake. But that's why it's important to clean up your components, your HTTP requests, your asynchronous code, just these streams of data like subscriptions, so that you make sure that there's no memory leakage. That's it.
And for cleaning the stuff up, is the best place you like to do it in like the return function of a use effect hook when something unmounts, or how do you kind of like to go about cleaning up these requests?
Yeah, I think that's the best place to go with. So previously, when we use more like class components, so you had actually like a function or a hook where you can place that and destroy. So, but the point is, once your component gets destroyed, or maybe it's like on a specific event when something happens. So maybe you're like on a specific feature, maybe you're closing a stream and you don't need it anymore. So it depends on the actual case, but good starting point is in the use effect where you're actually calling or making HTTP request. Just return that and clean it up. Yeah, like you said.
To me, it also sounds like Axios might give you. I've never actually used Axios. I'm somewhat familiar with just kind of seeing it in some different tutorials and stuff, but it sounds like that kind of gives you a built-in way of canceling requests. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I guess sometimes you made a request and then you start navigating maybe to other page and you don't have to wait it to finish or stuff like that. So that's a great way to just cancel out your request and there's no need to complete, right? So that's a great feature of it.
Mm-hmm. And I know that the fetch method, I believe you can use, I believe it's called the abort controller, in which you can kind of use a signal and then cancel your request that way as well.
Yes, you can do that as well. So it's like a built-in way. You don't have to like install any additional libraries. But the good thing with Axios is also like add some like security features on top of it out of the box, like cross-site forgery stuff. So there's those things that you have backed in inside of the Axios instead of just using the fetch. But again, like you mentioned, you never used it, so you can go by not using it, but if you need like these special cases, you can definitely include it as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would say for those listening to this, that's kind of a high level introduction of what you can do. If you're looking to how to actually like technically implement it, I'm sure Axios has documentation on canceling requests. And then also you can look up like the abort controller with the fetch API and see how that works as well. So I think that covers kind of canceling things and cleaning up things well. Are there any other mistakes that people make when it comes to handling HTTP requests in React? I think one thing that you mentioned is like maybe not really handling failed requests and providing user feedback.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure that you've come across application when you're doing something and just maybe application freezes, or you click on something and nothing happens. That's like the worst case scenario. At least you want to notify the user what happened. So in my opinion, there's two things that you need to do when something happens. So first thing is you need to make some kind of a report so that you know that something's happening. So usually the teams have some kind of a reporting system integrated into their application. And the second thing that you want to do is obviously to show that user-friendly error to your user, so it knows, hey, maybe the server is down, please come back later or try again in a couple of minutes, something like that. Or just so that they know it's not working at the moment and they can come back. So I think those two things are very often being missed on some applications, especially on new applications when somebody is just trying to release like MVP product, something to ship fast, and you just see like half of the application is not even clickable, or even maybe it's clickable but it's just failing and you don't know it.
And I know for us personally, we use Sentry.io for kind of some of that monitoring and stuff like that. And we personally really like that, but I believe there's like several tools out there that people can use for kind of that application monitoring and stuff. Is there any particular tool like that you personally like using or anything?
No, actually, I think usually this kind of stuff is forced by a client itself because they want to know what is failing with their applications. So I think there was like one of the libraries like called Jar or something like that. So there's like thousands of these libraries for reporting, but to be honest, I don't have any preference for them. Yeah.
And when it comes to handling these requests, do you recommend that people kind of use like error boundaries in React, or is it like just within the try catch block of their HTTP request, or how do you kind of recommend handling this errors?
Yeah, usually what I like to do, I mean, every single HTTP request that I make should be in try catch. So you should definitely create new error there when you catch something and just return back to the component so it can handle it properly. And at the same time, like you said, so error boundaries for components which may come up with some outputs that can cause breaking out the layout. I don't suggest that you do that on every single component, but obviously on components that are more prone to have the errors and that may break the component itself. So both of these are very useful and should be used for different use case scenarios. But yeah, like you mentioned, those are the two that I pretty much use all the time.
Perfect. Well, I think that handles HTTP requests very well and kind of gives a good overview on handling those in your application and kind of some things to look out for with cleaning them up and error handling as well. So I think a good place to move to here is another video that you created, and that was regarding code splitting. So could you maybe give an idea to the listeners of what code splitting even is? And then we can maybe get into why someone should even be concerned with code splitting?
Yeah, I think that first, why code splitting is now like a thing is previously like 15 years ago when we had like regular websites, when you refresh your page, you get loaded everything that you need on that page, right? But like since Angular first started like with single page applications and later all these other frameworks, so what they tended to do is to load everything at once. So the entire application is loaded, even though like you may only use like 10% of the code itself. So that's why we have this like code splitting pattern where you only try to use and load the code which is absolutely necessary for the page or the piece of the page where you're at the moment. So in React, we have multiple ways, but I think the most used one is actually route-based code splitting. So what it means is basically like it simulates the old websites. So when you load a particular page, just load the code that is absolutely necessary for that particular page. So that's what I use. I don't know what do you usually use, but for me, that's the one that pretty much I'm used like for almost any application.
Yep. Ours is also usually just route-based code splitting. Beyond that, like you could split out maybe more complex components and stuff like that. If like you're pulling in different external libraries specifically for a single component, that might be something that's good to code split. So you're not pulling in all that code for that. But yeah, I think you give a good overview there of code splitting is kind of more so this performance optimization tool that can allow you to only ship the code that's needed. And generally speaking, shipping less code to the browser is going to result in better performance in most of all cases. So it's kind of this performance optimization tool to ship a bit less code and kind of only ship chunks of your application at a specific time. So kind of with that layout there, how does someone usually go about code splitting in React? You kind of mentioned on a route-based level, but like, what does that kind of look like? Does someone need to pull in an external library to implement code splitting, or is it kind of built into React, or how does that kind of look like?
You actually have a function which is just React lazy function, and it's a function which request a module, and it's just basically a promise. So when that promise gets resolved, that module gets returned back, and then you just need to import this function inside of a suspense. And this suspense provides you with like a fallback component in case like you're waiting for this module to be loaded. And that's how it works. But like you mentioned, like if maybe you have a long page and maybe on that page you have some like a complex feature. For example, I created like a very interesting website with some interesting like 3D animations. And maybe you could like scroll to a page and you shouldn't be using this feature. Like maybe you are not using this feature. And if you want to try this feature where you get into like this 3D model interaction, which is very heavy on your application. So there's like portions of even components or features that you can lazy load. So that's why we have like this import module feature. So basically it works similar like the lazy load function. It just imports the specific module that you need, and once that is done, it's like a promise. Then you have all these functions available for you, like constants and whatnot, and then you can start executing the functions. But yeah, that's pretty much how lazy load works in React. Yeah.
Gotcha. So React kind of gives you these built-in functions that you can use kind of out of the box to lazy load things. And for those listening, lazy load is just a term that refers to kind of loading something only when you need to. It doesn't kind of load it right away. It kind of lazily just waits to load it only when it needs to do it. Like, if you might just sit on your couch until you absolutely have to get off it and go work. So taking a more kind of lazy route there, it actually can be beneficial in your React application. So I think that kind of gives a good overview of kind of what code splitting is. And I would say when it comes to like React performance, one of the easiest ways that you can kind of better optimize your app is with code splitting and just shipping less code on kind of a route by route basis. Or, like you said, if you have a big 3D animation library that is very resource intensive and pulls in a lot of code, if you can only load that when you absolutely have to and not like right away when you're just loading your sign-in page or something like that, that can drastically improve your kind of initial load speeds there. So I definitely think that's helpful. And maybe kind of the final thing that we can end with here is taking a turn a little bit into styling React applications, as a lot of people are kind of, React doesn't give you a specific way to do it. You have various ways to where you have styled components, just vanilla CSS. There's things like Tailwind and all these different things. Is there particular ways that you personally like to kind of style your applications for yourself?
Yeah, I think similar to other things like with the HTTP request, I changed my personal preferences on styling the components. At the beginning, it was just like using the classes and that's it. So I usually have like a component and then a separate CSS file next to that component and that's it. But since of late, like on one project, and this was like project where I just joined, so it was already implemented as like styled components. For me, like I thought that it's very, very, very interesting how they work. And it's also very neat inside of the components because you don't have the classes anymore, but actually you have this like component like syntax inside of the React components, which I like so much. And also like for the handling the states, you don't have to change the classes itself, but you're sending the properties through that new components, and then you manage the different colors, styles, and other properties in CSS. So for me, it's style component at the moment. It's like preferred way. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about them?
Yeah, so I kind of go back and forth on it as well. I think when I originally started, it was just kind of like you said, I would have my component.jsx, and then in that same file, I would have the CSS file as well, and just kind of do it that way. But I also kind of, once I started there, I went to styled components for a while for a lot of my personal projects, and I actually really like it, mainly for the reason of like, your styles are kind of like built into your component. It's all kind of in the same place, and it's all kind of scoped to that single component. And I definitely really like that feature of styled components, and I definitely enjoy that. I would say for my kind of professional application, we do just use kind of a combination of CSS and then some just like inline styles for kind of one-off things that we use and stuff. But it's mostly just kind of CSS, and even using kind of Material UI components and themes from Material UI as well, which from a theming perspective, that actually works out pretty well for us. But I definitely like styled components as well.
Yeah, nice. I mean, I see that there's a lot of hype around Tailwind, especially, and I think Tailwind is outstanding, and especially the classes are like for setting up the layouts and stuff and positioning. But where I found it very difficult is when you start, piling up the classes, and especially when you have something more complex and more specific that you want to apply to a specific element, then I see that it's very, it's not very optimized for those kind of classes. So they started creating new classes where they just jump in, they group basically the classes of Tailwind. And I see they're basically reinventing the wheel. So like if you want to use Tailwind, at least for me, I use it like for 70% of the application, and for very specific like components where you apply a lot of styles, I just create a regular CSS class and that's it. That's how I use it. I never use it like 100% only Tailwind. I don't know what's your experience.
So I haven't used Tailwind much. I've just kind of played around with it a little bit on certain projects here and there, but I haven't probably played with it enough to have a kind of strong opinion on how it works with a larger application. But I would say kind of to your point that often in most applications I work on, it's kind of using a combination of things. So it might be using some sort of theme from Material UI, or it could even be like Shocker UI or something like that. And then from there, I might have some sort of CSS. And one thing with Material UI that I actually really like is that you can actually export CSS variables and use those within your Material UI theme. So you can kind of have one CSS file that exports those to Material UI, and you can kind of theme things a lot easier that way. And like for our specific professional application, the user kind of is allowed to have different themes and stuff for the styling of their app. So that makes it super easy to just kind of have a click button of changing your complete look of your app. So a combination of the CSS variable exporting and Material UI works well for us there. But usually it ends up being like a combination of some sort of theme plus a little bit of CSS and then some different things mixed in there. But yeah, that's kind of where I land there.
Yeah, one of the things that I like though about Tailwind is because you define one class which you're like using very much in regular applications. For example, you're using display flags for like hundreds of times on medium application, but with Tailwind you just define it once. So the optimization of CSS is huge over there. But the only problem is, like I said, is that sometimes you cannot assign like 20 classes to a specific element. It just gets too long, and it doesn't look very like you cannot review the components that very much. And that's why I said style components are very nice. When you're looking at the component itself, you just focus on the logic itself and not on the styles that you apply, because it's extracted to the style component itself. Whereas Tailwind gets messy with all the classes, so it messes a little bit with your component itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think there's that kind of give and take of something like Tailwind, or even just writing CSS. In some sense, it's nice that you can just have this global CSS that can impact a whole bunch of different components, and you don't have to like worry about it as much. But that can also make things more tricky when it's like looking at a component and you're not certain why it's getting this certain style, or it's like not particularly clear why it has this sort of padding or margin set on it, and it's coming from some sort of global CSS that you don't even realize is being applied to it. So styled components is nice because it's like, exactly within that component what styles are being applied, and it's all kind of like co-located in that single file. So I think that is definitely a benefit, but it always comes up to like the trade-offs between the two.
Always. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think this is a good place to end it here. I definitely appreciate you coming on and kind of giving definitely some good advice here. If people want to kind of follow what you're doing, we kind of mentioned in the intro, but where can people go to kind of stay up to date with the content that you're producing?
Yeah, they can go to LinkedIn and just type in Code with Sloba, and they will definitely find some posts. Or they can just type in my name, Slobodan Gajic. And also they can go over to Instagram and just type in Code with Sloba, same as on YouTube channels. So pretty much that's all the channels that I'm being very active. So, and I'm always looking for like new interactions, and that's why I'm starting this this whole community, because I'm always keen to interact with people, especially as a remote worker, and to get some new feedback. I share educational content, but also I learn so much from the feedback from people, from comments, and I get great responses back. So that's why I'm doing all of this. So please check out those accounts, and hopefully you can learn a thing or two. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Sloba.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to talk to you, man.